Hi, thanks for joining me, Mindy Mandell here. Today I'm going to be talking about Book 3 of Plato's Laws. Now here Plato is going on with his discussion of education, but Book 3 is a really important book because here he's going into why we need this education. So when we come to philosophy, when we come to the kind of education that Plato is talking about when he talks about education, we bring a certain state of mind with us from our families. And what we want to look at is what that state of mind is and why it's not enough ultimately, why we need this other kind of education. So that's what we're looking at, and that's where we're going. Let's see how Plato does it. So all of our translations, as I've been using throughout the laws, are from Robert Gregg Bury. Here's how he's starting out today. During this time, have not thousands upon thousands of states come into existence, and on a similar computation, just as many perished? And have they not in each case exhibited all kinds of constitutions over and over again? And have they not changed at one time from small to great, at another from great to small, and changed also from good to bad and from bad to good? Necessarily. Of this process of change, let us discover, if we can, the cause. For this perhaps would show us what is the primary origin of constitutions as well as their transformation. Just a quick reminder here that there is a constant analogy going on, even though it hasn't been directly stated. Plato uses the word constitution as a double meaning. He used it in the Republic the same way that you can talk about a government's constitution, but you can also talk about the constitution of the soul. So we always want to keep that in mind. All right, do you consider that there is any truth in the ancient tales? What tales? That the world of people has often been destroyed by floods, plagues, and many other things, in such a way that only a small portion of the human race has survived. Everyone would regard such accounts as perfectly credible. Come now, let us picture to ourselves one of the many catastrophes, namely that which occurred once upon a time through the deluge. And what are we to imagine about it? That the people who then escaped destruction must have been mostly herdsmen of the hills, scanty embers of the human race preserved somewhere in the mountain tops, evidently. This is a similar story, by the way, to what he used in the dialogue Critias. Moreover, people of this kind must necessarily have been unskilled in the arts generally, and especially in such contrivances as people use against one another in cities for purposes of greed and rivalry and all other villainies which they devise one against another. It is certainly probable. And as to the matters with which our present discourse is concerned, states and statecraft and legislation, do we think they could have retained any memory whatsoever, broadly speaking, of such matters? By no means. So from those people in that situation, there has sprung the whole of our present order, states and constitutions, arts and laws, with a great amount both of evil and of good? How do you mean? Do we imagine, my good sir, that the people of that age, who were unversed in the ways of city life, many of them noble, many ignoble, were perfect either in virtue or in vice? Well said. We grasp your meaning. Okay, now let's see where he's going with this. He says, now a community which has no communion with either poverty or wealth is generally the one in which the noblest characters will be formed. For in it there is no place for the growth of insolence and injustice, of rivalries and jealousies. So these people were good, both for these reasons and because of their simple-mindedness, as it is called. For being simple-minded, when they heard things called good or bad, they took what was said for gospel truth, and they believed it. For none of them had the shrewdness of the modern person to suspect a falsehood, but they accepted as true the statements made about gods and men, and they ordered their lives by them. So now we can start to see here some similarities to the Republic, to what he did there. Now in the Republic, He was looking for justice in the soul, and he set up an analogy of let's look at the city-state as an analogy to the soul because it's easier to look at. And if we can find justice there, maybe we can find it in the soul as well. And so there he could talk a little bit about the person in a psychological sense, or breaking it up philosophically. And so he could talk about childhood as this time when we're simple-minded and trusting of our parents. Don't question the things they do in the way we would as an adult. Here, because he's not making such an open analogy, it's still there, but he didn't state that he's going to do this. And so he's only on the surface planning a government. Therefore, instead of talking about childhood, he talks about a time when we were very early in our civilization, when we just formed clans and we didn't have the sophistication, if you will, of the modern city. So he's using different stories, on the surface, different stories to talk about what he wants to say here. But the analog underneath is very much the same in the Republican here. He's talking, if we're looking at the soul, a time when our souls are still young, coming out of childhood. And so keeping that in mind, let's go on. He says, we must bear in mind that the whole purpose of what we have said and of what we are going to say next is this, that we may understand what possible need of laws the people of that time had and who their lawgiver was. So if we understand this as an analog to childhood, then the people of that time means children. People at that time, we would say. Now, it's very easy to see this when you're looking at people who had unhealthy parents. Even though there's craziness, if you will, in the family, there's a certain dynamic that you have to learn. You need the laws to survive. There are certain things you have to learn, even if they're unhealthy, in order to survive that dynamic. So you see the need of those laws, and who the lawgiver was the parents. Even for those of us who grew up in healthier environments and relatively healthy families, there's still a certain dynamic we have to learn as children, and so there's a certain need of learning the laws of the family. Okay, now here's the really important passage. While these larger settlements were growing out of the original small ones, each of the small settlements continued to retain, clan by clan, both the rules of the eldest and also some customs derived from its isolated condition and peculiar to itself. As those who begot and reared them were different, so these customs of theirs relating to the gods and to themselves differed, being more orderly where their forefathers had been orderly, and more brave where they had been brave. And as thus the fathers of each clan in due course stamped upon their children and their children's children their own cast of mind. These people came, as we say, into the larger community, furnished each with their own peculiar laws. And so there you see he's talking about the family laws, the conventional mindset that you bring with you from your parents and also your society as a whole. And so Plato did recognize a need to recognize these sorts of beliefs, not just the philosophical beliefs that we question through dialectic, but also we have to use a similar sort of dialectic to look at our family beliefs and to question our own assumptions coming into philosophy. Now, we don't have any particular method from Plato to do this. It's possible that at his academy he did have some methods that he just never wrote about. Maybe his dialogues are more of a framework of what we need to do rather than giving us the exact techniques. Whether he actually had a method or not, it's certainly missing from modern Platonism. And so this is where philosophical counseling got its start. And we all need to take on some sort of practice to look at our own family belief system and throw out whatever doesn't fit anymore. I'm going to show you a book that I find very helpful. This is Dr. Pierre Grimes. He is the founder of the philosophical counseling movement. He first published back in 1953, and he's still quite active. He's in his 90s now. Someone told me the other day that he's 98, which is amazing to me. He's very sharp, very much alert and very active. He's the teacher that I've been working with for the past 20 years or so. And so maybe I'm a little biased, but I find his methods to be very good and the most comprehensive. This is his seminal work called Philosophical Midwifery. He calls it that because in the dialogue Theaetetus, Socrates compares himself to a midwife, saying that instead of helping women give birth to human babies, he helps people give birth to insights. And so he calls himself a kind of midwife. And so that's where it comes from. But this is the root of, or the start of modern philosophical counseling. I guess I can also give a shout out to my own book. I published a book last year called Discovering the Beauty of Wisdom. It is not only about uprooting these false beliefs, but it does include a few chapters on this idea and the need for it. And of course, what I wrote is based on my experiences of working with Dr. Grimes's methods. But whatever method you use, whether it's these or you use some other person's method, any kind of counseling or your own ideas of how to look at it in some way or another, it's very important to look at these sorts of belief structures. And so we see here that Plato recognized it as well, and he says it here as well. If we can gather from all of this which of these settlements was right and which was wrong, the beliefs that you came with, which ones were good and which ones were unhealthy, which laws keep safe what is kept safe and which laws ruin what is ruined, and what changes in what particulars would affect the happiness of the state. Then, O Megillus and Clinias, we ought to describe these things again, making a fresh start from the beginning. You can't really talk about education unless you recognize the starting point, because we're not blank slates. We don't come into this world as blank slates, and we certainly don't come to philosophy as blank slates. Now, it's going to seem on the surface here initially that Plato is changing topics, but actually it's all going to tie back together. So let's see how he's going to do this. Here he's going to show us why we need to question those family beliefs. Come now, is there one object of desire, that one now indicated by our argument, which is common to all of us? What is that? The desire that, if possible, everything, or failing that, all that is humanly possible, should happen in accordance with the demands of one's own heart. To be sure. Since this is what we all wish always, alike in childhood and adulthood and old age, it is for this necessarily that we should pray continually. Of course. Moreover, on behalf of our friends, we will join in making the same prayer which they make on their own behalf. To be sure. So on the surface, it sounds like maybe he is supporting the idea of manifestation, which is a very common spiritual practice these days. So the idea that you can pray for things and manifest your desires into the world. Or you often hear people say that they will pray for you as a very important part of their spiritual practice. So it seems like he's supporting that. But as we go on, we'll see that there is a caveat. A son is a friend to his father, the boy to the man. Certainly. Yet the father will often pray to God that the things which the son prays to obtain may in no wise be granted according to the son's prayers. Do you mean when the son who is praying is still young and foolish? And yes, that's one case, and here's another one. When the father, either through old age or through the hot temper of his youth, being devoid of all sense of right and justice, indulges in the vehement prayers of passion, while the son, on the contrary, has a sense of justice. In this case, do you suppose that the son will echo the father's prayers? I grasp your meaning. You mean, as I suppose, that what a man ought to pray and press for is not that everything should follow his own desire, while his desire in no way follows his own reason. But it is the winning of wisdom that every one of us, states and individuals alike, ought to pray for and strive after. Okay, so Megillus is not given a very large speaking part in this dialogue, but I do think that Plato gave him one of the best lines. This one that I put in red. The idea being that he's not against manifestation the way atheists are, saying that it's nonsense. Rather, he's saying it does work, and that's the problem. because too often we pray for those human desires rather than the divine ones. So in last week's video in Book 2, I gave you two different lists that Plato had presented in Book 2, what he called the human desires, things like beauty and wealth and so on, and then there were the divine desires, namely the virtues. And too often we focus on the human ones because we lack wisdom. And he says if you're going to pray for anything, pray for those divine desires, such as wisdom. That's what we really need. If you have that, you don't need to pray for the other stuff. And he goes on to say, what is more, I would recall to your recollection, as well as to my own, how it was said, if you remember, at the outset, that the legislator of a state, in settling his own ordinances, must always have regard to wisdom. The injunction you gave back in Book 1 was that the good lawgiver must frame all of his laws with a view to war. But I, on the other hand, maintained that whereas by your injunction the laws would be framed with reference to one only of the four virtues, it was really essential to look to the whole of virtue, and first and above all, to pay regard to the principal virtue of the four, which is wisdom and reason and right opinion, together with the love and desire that accompany them. So he calls it the principal virtue. He put it at the top of the list of divine virtues because this one is at the root of the other three. And he says, now the argument has come back again to the same point, and I now repeat my former statement, in jest with you, if you will, or else in earnest. And by the way, just a side note, this language here, in jest or else in earnest, was imitated in the dialogue Epinomis, which I do believe is a spurious one, and I think the author was imitating here, trying to match the Athenian stranger. Just a side note, but anyway, he says, I repeat my former statement. I assert that prayer is a perilous practice for him who is devoid of reason, and that what he obtains is the opposite of his desires. For I certainly expect that, as you follow the argument recently propounded, you will now discover that the cause of the ruin of those kingdoms, in its analog the soul, and of their whole design, was not cowardice or ignorance of warfare on the part either of the rulers or of those who should have been their subjects, but that what ruined them was badness of all other kinds, especially ignorance concerning the greatest of human interests. Okay, what I want to focus on here is this phrase here, the whole design of the soul. So again, remember that wisdom is at the root. The other three build on it. Now, I did do a whole video on the virtues, so I'm not going to go into this in great detail, but basically the other three virtues build on wisdom. The wiser the soul, the more courageous it will be, because it will be easier to stay focused on wisdom and not be distracted by pleasures or pains. And if you know what wisdom is, then it's easier for the desires to naturally fall in line with what is healthy for the soul. And when the three parts of the soul, and there was a description of the three, or Plato's theory, the three parts of the soul, it's in Book 4 of the Republic. I've talked about it in those videos and other places, but the idea of there being three parts of the soul, and when those parts or aspects are each carrying out their proper function, then you have what he calls the state of mind of justice. And so those other three virtues all build on wisdom. The greater the wisdom, the stronger the other virtues will be as well. And so if wisdom fails, the whole design fails. Well then, to advance further on the track of our discourse, we assert that it was ignorance in its greatest form, which at that time destroyed the power we've described, and which naturally produces still the same results. And if this is so, it follows that the lawgiver must try to implant in states as much wisdom as possible, and to root out folly to the utmost of his power. This phrase at that time, it's hard to understand here because I took it out of context, but he was using a political example, but I'm just focusing on the soul, and what we see here is these two parts that we've been talking about today. We want to implant wisdom, and we want to root out folly. So we have these two aspects, these two ways that we have to come at the education of our soul. And so we're seeing here again why we need this sort of practice, some sort of philosophical counseling, or some form of that, because otherwise we're going to be praying for and aiming for those humanly desires rather than the divine ones. We're not going to be developing wisdom as we should. Okay, so what kind of ignorance would deserve to be called the greatest? Consider whether you will agree with my description. I take it to be ignorance of this kind: that which we see in the person who hates instead of loving what that person judges to be noble and good, while loving and cherishing what that person judges to be evil and unjust. That want of accord on the account of feelings of pain and pleasure with the rational judgment is, I maintain, the extreme form of ignorance, and also the greatest, because it belongs to the main mass of the soul, the desire-loving part. For the part of the soul that feels pain and pleasure corresponds to the mass of the populace in the state. The thumos, or the part that feels pleasure and pain, it corresponds to the desire-loving part of the soul. So whenever this part opposes what are by nature the ruling principles, knowledge, right opinion, and reason, this condition I call folly, whether it be in a state when the masses disobey the rulers and the laws, or in an individual when the noble elements of reason existing in the soul produce no good effect, but quite the contrary. So now he's bringing the three parts of the soul together, right? That when the desire-loving part follows the wisdom-loving part, then you have what he calls temperance, and then the thumos, or the part that feels pleasure and pain, the part that courage makes its home in, that will also follow wisdom and will be more courageous. And so the three parts working together. Ooh, doing a lot of talking today. All right. Well, without harmony, my friend, how could even the smallest fraction of wisdom exist? It is impossible. But the greatest and best of harmonies would most properly be accounted the greatest wisdom. And therein, he who lives rationally has a share, whereas he who is devoid thereof will always prove to be a homewrecker in anything rather than a savior of the state, because of his ignorance in these matters. So now he's bringing in the idea of harmony. Now, harmony we saw attached to music, but we also saw last week that harmony was also tied in with the idea of temperance, or sophrosyne. And we saw that in the last quote as well, how there's a harmony of the three parts when they're all working together. When the desires fall in line with what is wise, and then with courage also follows, the three parts then have a certain harmony with one another. So wherever you see harmony, you also see the idea of temperance. We tend to associate temperance with the desire-loving part because the desires will fall in line with what is wise. But it also carries with it this idea of harmony. It runs through all three, really, three parts. And it's that harmony, that balance. All right, well, if one neglects, the rule of due measure, and gives things too great in power to things too small, sails to ships, food to bodies, offices of rule to souls, then everything is upset, and they run through excess of insolence, some to bodily disorders, others to that offspring of insolence, injustice. What then is our conclusion? Is it not this? There does not exist, my friends, a mortal soul whose nature, when young and irresponsible, will ever be able to stand being in the highest ruling position upon earth without getting surfeited in mind with that greatest of disorders, folly, and earning the detestation of its nearest friends. And when this occurs, it speedily ruins the soul itself, and it annihilates the whole of its power. To guard against this by perceiving the due measure is the task of the great lawgiver. Okay, so if we simply stay with the laws that we learned in childhood, the conventional mindset, the desires are naturally going to go in the wrong direction towards folly. And so we need education. We need to learn what he's calling here due measure. We need to give greater weight to the divine goods than to the human goods, because without such an education, we're naturally to some degree going to give too much weight, undue measure, to the human goods. A state ought to be free and wise and in friendship with itself, and the lawgiver should legislate with a view to this. So we have three terms here: freedom, wisdom, and friendship. So we have to see how he's using these three. Now we're going to come back to freedom in a moment, but first, here's a little passage about wisdom and friendship. He says, one needs to reflect that wisdom and friendship, when stated to be the aim in view, are not really different aims, but they're identical. And if we meet with many other such terms, let not this fact disturb us. So when we're talking about the aim of the virtues, we ultimately want to develop them to the point where they function as a unity. Their highest flowering, they function together. We can talk about them as four separate virtues, and they admit of degrees. We grow deeper, if you will, in each of these virtues as we go along. But ultimately, when we reach the state of mind, like, say, Socrates, the four are working together in a unity. And when you have that unity, you have a state of mind that we can call wisdom. But we can also talk about that state of mind as that unity, as the harmony or the friendship. And so wherever you see friendship, that's also kind of a throw to Sophrosyn or temperance. We can also, like in the Republic, he said that when you have that unity, the parts are all working together in their own proper balance. They're all carrying out their proper function, the three parts of the soul. And so because there he was focusing on justice, he called that unity justice. He doesn't usually call it courage, but we can even use that name as well, because a Socratic character is somebody who is highly courageous. The state of mind that Socrates was in allowed him to face his death with great courage. It allowed him to fight in battle. There are some cases, some stories of when he was in war, when he fought as a soldier, and he was highly courageous. There are many examples of him being courageous as well, because there's one state of mind that's being described. But we can come at it from different angles depending on what we're talking about, what we want to show, what we want to focus on in that discussion. And so sometimes he'll call it wisdom, sometimes he'll call it temperance, sometimes justice, sometimes courage. He'll use all different words for it. But if you understand that they're all focused on that same state of mind, then you won't be disturbed by the fact that he calls them by different names. All right, now he's going to bring in the idea of monarchy and democracy to bring in what he means by freedom. There are two mother forms of constitutions, so to call them, from which one may truly say all the rest are derived. Of these, the one is properly termed monarchy, the other democracy. Now, it is essential for a polity to partake of both these two forms, if it is to have freedom and friendliness combined with wisdom. And that is what our argument intends to enjoin, when it declares that a state which does not partake of these can never be rightly constituted. Okay, now in the Republic, he used the monarchy or aristocracy to symbolize the healthy state of mind. And then he gave us four other government constitutions that represented various degradations from that ideal. And democracy was presented as the second to last. It was put in a negative light. Now we can see that democracy has something to do with freedom, the idea that we are each free to do as we please, one person, one vote. It was used in the Republic to be an analogy to the soul. So just as we say one person, one vote in the government system, we can say one desire, one vote in the soul. And so all desires were just sort of lumped together. It didn't matter which desires were wise, which were unwise, which was healthy for our lives, which were unhealthy. They were all given equal status. And that was the way democracy was presented in the Republic. Now, obviously, he's saying something more positive here. There's a more positive way to understand this freedom. But we have to see then what he's talking about. So let's see how he contrasts the two. Nor indeed is it right that preeminent honors in a state should be conferred on a person because that person is especially wealthy or any more than it is right to confer them because that person is swift or comely or strong, but without any virtue, or with a virtue devoid of temperance. So temperance is the key, because the temperance soul is not the one that resists temptation, that desperately wants to do something unhealthy, but knows they were taught otherwise, and so they refrain from that behavior. That's not the ideal of temperance. The temperate person naturally desires what is healthy for the soul. So there's a certain freedom about it, but it's a freedom that is guided by wisdom. And so that makes it different from the kind of freedom that Plato wrote about in the Republic. We ought to examine next, in like manner, the Attic polity, and show how complete liberty, unfettered by any authority, not guided by the wisdom-loving part of the soul, is vastly inferior to a moderate form of government under elected magistrates. And of course, in the analogy to the soul, the elected magistrates would be the wisdom-loving part of the soul that guides and is the leader of the soul. Now, to make his point even stronger, he's going to refer back to music, and we'll see here many similarities to what we saw in Book 2. The music of that age, in the first place, to describe from its commencement how the life of excessive liberty grew up. Among us at that time, music was divided into various classes and styles. So these and other kinds being classified and fixed, it was forbidden to set one kind of words to a different class of tune. The authority whose duty it was to know these regulations, and when known, to apply them in its judgments and to penalize the disobedient, was not a pipe, nor as now the mob's unmusical shoutings, nor yet the clappings which mark applause. In place of this, it was a rule made by those in control of education, that they themselves should listen throughout in silence. So this is very much like what we saw in Book 2. I won't go into it in great length here, but we see that he's really talking about the soul being guided by the wisdom-loving part, rather than by being influenced by popular ideas. All right, later on, with the progress of time, there arose as leaders of unmusical illegality the poets who, though by nature, poetical, they were ignorant of what was just and lawful in music. And they, being frenzied and unduly possessed by a spirit of pleasure, they did some wild things, those crazy kids. They mixed dirges with hymns and paeans with dithyrambs, and they imitated flute tunes with harp tunes, and they blended every kind of music with every other. And thus, through their folly, they unwittingly bore false witness against music as a thing without standard of correctness, of which the best criterion is the pleasure of the auditor, whether that person is a good person or wise person or an unwise. So again, on the surface, it seems rather silly. You seem like the old man yelling, "Get off my lawn and turn the music down, you crazy kids." So that's what it looks like on the surface, but if we see this as the analogy to the soul, we see he's going in a very different direction here. It has a lot more meaning, right? By compositions of such a character, set to similar words, they bred in the populace a spirit of lawlessness in regard to music, and the effrontery of supposing themselves capable of passing judgment on it. For if in music and music only there had risen a democracy of freedom, such a result would not have been so very alarming. If we were really only talking about music, who cares? But we're not. We're looking at the state of the soul, the state of mind. As it was, the universal conceit of universal wisdom and the contempt for law originated in the music, and on the heels of these came liberty. For thinking themselves knowing, people became fearless, and audacity begat effrontery. For to be fearless of the opinion of wiser people, here's what he means by the better man is the wiser one, owing to self-confidence, is nothing else than base effrontery, and it is brought about by a liberty that is audacious to excess. And so now he's going to wrap it up, bringing the three terms back together. The lawgiver must aim in his legislation at three objectives: to make the state or the soul that he's legislating for free and at unity with itself and possessed of sense. So at unity with itself, having that certain unity of the soul, that is the mark of temperance and justice. And when you have that, then that means you're letting the wisdom-loving part of the soul be your guide. You're guided by wisdom, so you're possessed of sense. And when you're possessed of sense, it means that the desires are naturally flowing freely towards what is healthy for the soul, for your community. And so you have a healthy kind of freedom in your unity with yourself and possessed of sense. So that's the state of mind that we're aiming for. And then he's going to wrap up book 3, saying that the object of all of these discourses, not just book 3, but bringing in books 1 and 2 as well, the object of all of this is to discover how best the state or the soul, its analog, must be managed, and how best the individual citizen must pass their life. So that brings us to the end of book 3. As always, if you like what you're seeing, I would appreciate a thumbs up. And also please think about subscribing if you don't already. You will get notifications if you click that little bell icon. I think everyone knows that by now. And also, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them below. There's also an email address in the description box. So thank you very much, and I do hope you'll join me next week for book 4.